We have two sessions with Casey today, one before lunch.
Hardly sit up.
That would never happen. So one before lunch, one after lunch, talking about fundraising strategies and pitch decks. This one's going to be on strategy. Casey is the CSO and partner of Sante Ventures, which is, I think you guys are up to $1 billion under management. Assets under management, on your fourth fund, and not just a hat rack sometimes. And definitely one of the most active, if not the most active, biotech investors in Texas. So really excited to have him here. Casey's seen a ton of deals, and I love talking to Casey around this kind of thing because he's always got a really nice, even-keeled but straightforward perspective on how to think about fundraising. So with that, I'm gonna let you take it over.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. So Sarah mentioned I'm with Sante Ventures, which is an early stage venture capital fund. We just raised our fourth fund. It's $260 million. Our main office is in Austin, but we have an office in Boston as well, which I was here, but I now help staff that office, although I'm back here so often it doesn't seem like I ever left. So you may still bump into me going forward. So, you know, I'm on a, so Dan gave a great talk. I mean, about full of pearls of wisdom and financing structure considerations that you need to think about and all that kind of stuff. But before you can dive into a term sheet and try and define what those obscure clauses really mean, you've got to get to the point where somebody wants to give you a term sheet. And so what I want to kind of cover is to step back from some of the no investor ever said, I'm in the market for a convertible note with $5 million valuation cap and 20% discount, and that comes later. They're in the market for particular kinds of investment opportunities, and then the sports trim package on the car is discussed afterwards. So I would say that, so I want to, again, this is kind of a high level talk about how you think about financing your company. And I would start with something that seems really obvious, which is here on the slide. The most important part of fundraising is to know what you are. And what do I mean by that? I mean that what kind of business am I building? And it's not just to change the world, although that's a noble goal and what gets us up in the morning. It's specifically what kind of business am I building? Am I selling service? Am I trying to develop a drug? Am I developing a device? Is it a lab enabling tool? Really hone in on that and define that. Is it a therapeutic? Is it? Because then that will define how you're going to make money. So if I'm a service company, I'm going to make money by selling my services. And once I get to the point where I'm bringing in more money than I'm spending, I'm making a profit. If I'm an early stage biotech company with a new and exciting therapeutic, I will probably never make profit. I hope. Hope I get bought. I tell people, my entrepreneurs all the time, the day you sell your first pill, I failed. The company needs to be acquired before then. So you've got to concentrate on what kind of business am I and how am I going to make money? Because corollary to that is, how's my investor going to make money? And you really need to think about that and define how you'll make money and how your investor will make money, because there are a lot of different ways that can happen, but that's going to determine the kind of investor that you want to approach. So ask, how long is it going to take before I make money? What needs to happen? How long to approval? for a device because they rarely make any money or get bought before they get approved, whereas drugs can get acquired much earlier. For services and tech and diagnostics and things, how long is it before I get to break-even sales? So it's very important to know how long that's going to take because, again, that'll determine the kind of investor that you go for. And then when you do start making money, what form does that take? So is it sales? Is it getting acquired? Because it's how long, how much, and then in what form. Different ways of making money have different liquidities. How quickly your investor can convert that into cash. And that's a consideration for them, and so it needs to be a consideration for you. Be ready to answer the question, when and how do I get paid? So to further set this up about how you should think about what am I, you also need to sit down and define milestones and inflection points. Now, Dan talked about that a little bit in his talk about, tranche funding, getting to various milestone base, but it's very important to sort of keep in mind that there's a difference. Both of these are kind of discontinuous jumps in the product development, but a milestone is a point where you reduce risk by showing that you can do something, building a prototype or validating a manufacturing process, filing an IND. I will often hear entrepreneurs speak of those as though they're large increases in value, but they're not. They're just places where you reduce risk. The place where you increase value is an inflection point. That can be something like getting your clinical trial started, more importantly, finished. Can be a favorable regulatory opinion by the FDA. It's something that really increases the likelihood of success, also increases the value of the company. The reason I make the distinction about differentiating between milestones and inflection points, at least with your own development plan, is because different kinds of investors will value milestones and inflection points somewhat differently. And that may sound a little confusing right now, but I think you'll see what I mean here in a bit when we talk about different kinds of investors. So now and by the way, at any point, raise your hand, ask questions. I mean, this needs to be this is not a lecture. This is a free-flowing dialogue here. So now you've asked yourself, what's my core business? How do I make money? What are my milestones? What are the inflection points? How long is it going to take? How much increase in value do I think I'll have? How much money do I need to get to each of those milestones? How much money do I need to get to those inflection points? Now you're ready to ask, okay, I've got a pretty clear idea of what I am. Now, what kind of investor am I looking for? So I always make this point. Entrepreneurs are often told they need to knock on 1,000 doors to get funded. But the answer is known behind most of those doors before you walk in, and it's got nothing to do. So the more that you can filter out the sorts of investors or funds that are never going to fund you, the fewer doors you have to bang your head against. And so that's the exercise that I'm trying to sort of convey here. It's who do I fit? And that fit's not going to be permanent. So there'll be a fund that you're a fit for now, and in 6 months you won't be a fit for because they're at a different point in their fund. They overweighted in a certain space, or they're, getting ready to go out and raise the next fund, or something will change. It's a dynamic thing. You can ask as you talk to funds, you can ask where you are. Entrepreneurs tend to think about investors as just a sort of sea of checkbooks. I can just get one of them to write me a check, then I'll be able to get going. But in fact, investors come in a lot of different flavors. So if you look up the definition of investor, it's somebody that's, making an investment with the expectation of return or other gain, if you read Webster's definition. And entrepreneurs often fall into the trap of only hearing the business about financial return. They don't hear the part about other. So the question that you want to ask is, of each type of investor, what's their report card? What does success look like for them? It'll be different for different investors. And the more closely you can match what their report card is measuring, the more likely you are to be attracted to them as an investment. So the spectrum of investors includes your family and friends, granting agencies, philanthropic funds, angel investors, both the individuals, and institutional investors. And that last is a chapter heading into itself that we'll get further into a little bit later. So let's take a look at these. Friends and family first. That's often the earliest capital in some of these startups. It's risky. They are generally unsophisticated. They often have extremely unrealistic expectations about how quickly they'll get a return, about how much that return will be. You can ruin a lot of friendships and family relationships in a hurry doing that. It is not no strings attached money. It is risky for them. It is risky for you. And you need to be really clear when you're thinking about that, the kind of risk that you're both taking and giving. Granting agencies, always worth considering. Even if you've raised institutional money, always be thinking about how can I bring in non-dilutive capital. The problem is they often have lengthy timelines to when you can actually get the money from them, even if you're successful. Now, I see a lot of decks where people talk about, they've gotten this grant, this SBIR, this what, it's gotten $3 million in NIH funding to the basic research labs, things like that. And they trumpet that as though that's some sort of diligence process that they've now been through. The diligence process, I spent 5 years on a study section for the SBIR program. The diligence process for that grant is a lot different than the diligence process for most investors, particularly institutional investors. It's not the same, and it shouldn't be portrayed as the same. Granting agencies, their report card is getting the money out the door. They don't disperse all the money, their budget will be cut the next year. They're almost 100% milestone driven. So remember the specific aims of the grant? It's not inflection points, it's milestones, almost totally. So now you've lined up your milestones, you can kind of see how that might fit into a grant. Angel investors. So rich people who are, yes, sir.
I got a question.
Yep.
I understand about grants to replace the diligence, but don't they also validate technology if there's been a lot of support for the development of technology that is being peer reviewed over and over again?
Depends on what you mean by validate. So it is validated in terms of this is interesting science and it has raised these questions that now need to be explored. And here's how I propose to explore those. Here are the experiments that are in studies that I will run that will help answer the question that's been raised on my initial discovery. That's not really validation in the same sense that the science is. So from a investor viewpoint, I want cutting edge science, but I want the science completely understood. I'm not in the business of trying to discover new biology here. And a grant review agency, so a study section is sort of interested in how you're going to find this new biology. And is that validated, how you're going to approach it? It's not validating the answer, it's validating the process.
Yeah, I get asked that a lot, you know, you seek the money, get our money, and it seems to me that people want to see that. They've actually got that much money, not early, not from the early discovery stuff.
Yeah, some do. So again, it'll, you know, you'll discover there's a different level of sophistication across different funds. So some of them that are lighter on the sort of science heavy hitting, that's helpful to them. They want to see publications, they want to see grants, they want to see that kind of stuff. It's a stand-in for that portion of their diligence, but it's not, I mean, it checks a box, but it's not really the same thing as diligence. Yeah. So angel investors, and increasingly they'll organize themselves into networks or pools so that they can deploy more capital. They can be a real source of not just money, but expertise. If you pick an angel investor that's from your space, I mean, it can be a great deal for you. There's no question about it. They tend to focus on milestones early on because if they know the space, they know the things that you sort of need to achieve to kind of de-risk the, I shouldn't use that word. Later on, I'll talk to you in the pitch deck. Get rid of that word from your vocabulary. Anybody that says the word de-risk or this is de-risked, you just everybody's eyes roll. It is de-risked when the FDA approves it, and not an accelerated approval because it's still not de-risked. So angels tend to focus on milestones early on. They don't have a lot of portfolio balance because they want to concentrate on things that they know well. So you approaching an angel group or an angel investor who's from a different space is probably not going to do you a lot of good. Even if you got a check from them, it's not going to do you as much good as it would be if you were talking to somebody who actually understood the space and could give you some help. Family offices. So those can also be a source of significant amount of capital. They certainly want returns, but they often will have something else on the report card. There'll be a disease that runs in the family or even a geographic area. There was a well-known fund in Dallas for many years that was backed by a family office, and they could only do deals in Texas and Colorado because that's where the main source of money had homes. So you might all know who I'm talking about. Yeah. They can be fairly variable in terms of expertise. They're usually pretty sophisticated financially. Milestones do tend to be more important to the family offices. Now, there's some terminology on here. I kind of got the slides a little bit out of order. One way to think about how you sort different institutional investors is where does the money come from and how frequently is it replenished? And we'll cover that in a moment. So the family offices usually only have one source of money. It's the family. And they often can get money almost on a deal-to-deal basis. And that has some importance for as you think about fund life cycles and when you're pitching a particular fund. Philanthropic funds. So these have changed over the last 10 years. It used to be, and still is for a lot of them, or certain sections, that they could be classified as sort of granting agencies. So they fund a lot of, academic research projects. It's clearly around a particular disease or disease space, there's no question. They're very sophisticated scientifically. So to your question, money from an organization like that does carry probably more weight because they're also assessing not just how's the process of the experiments, but also what's the likelihood you're actually going to make a difference here. The thing that's changed is that, and this actually, I know the precise moment that this change happened. It was the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Mm-hmm. When they made $1 gajillion by investing in and supporting Vertex. that all of a sudden, every other charitable organization in the life sciences sat up and said, why can't we do that? And so many of them have started a venture fund. These vary in terms of how much they're mission driven, as opposed to just trying to make money from returns. And it's probably going to change again, because at some point they're going to start attracting regulatory attention, from the SEC and the IRS, because they're taking charitable dollars and it goes out the door, sometimes relatively unsupervised. I can speak to this with particular expertise because I'm on the National Board of Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and I'm the chair of their Therapy Acceleration Program, which is their venture philanthropy fund. And so I just went through with our council an exercise in cleaning up the documentation of the process of how we would disperse dollars, because we could see this scrutiny coming. They're balancing, one, they kind of want to return, because the more that you can have the organization funded that's not totally dependent on donations, which are totally dependent on how the economy is doing, the more stable your bottom line is. But they have to be mission driven. So it has to be investments into companies that are doing something in the space that your charitable organization is interested in. So it's worth, if you think you've got something and there's a patient advocacy organization or a charity or something like that has the capability of doing some funding, it's worth calling them up and having a conversation about what it is. What are their metrics? What are their report cards? What are they looking for? They will oftentimes take a lot more risk than investors that are solely focused on returns will. So now we come to true institutional investors. And it won't surprise you to learn that I'm going to break those down into various classes as well. So it's not just a sea of checklists. So most entrepreneurs at one point or another will talk about approaching a venture fund. But there are different kinds of venture funds, and they have different report cards. So there are corporate venture funds. There are, I've already covered family funds, some others like that. There's private equity funds. And there's traditional venture capital. And to a lot of people, private equity and traditional venture capital kind of blend in together. At parties, I get berated by people saying the venture capitalists bought this and ran it to the ground. And they're talking about a hedge fund. It's not, I didn't do this. So these different flavors of institutional investors will share a lot of characteristics, but there are some differences that you need to understand. So let's take care of that last one, private equity, first. You're probably not going to be talking to a private equity. They are typically interested in companies that are already making money. They're providing growth capital. Their entire financial model is different. Every one of their investments needs to make money. And so you with a risky startup are not going to get money from that. So the ones you're most likely to approach are the ones that call themselves venture capital funds. But here again, you need to ask a couple of questions. Where do they get their money? Limited partners. When do they get their money? And what's their performance metric or report card, like we've been talking about? So corporate venture. It's a single LP fund, single source of money. The money source is the corporation. For life sciences, that's often a pharmaceutical company or a medical device company. They are usually evergreen funds. Some of them are structured where they occasionally have to go back and justify their existence to the mothership and get a new batch of money. But by and large, it's going to be a stream of money. Their report card's only partly based on returns. Part of their interest is in strategic, objectives, finding new technologies for the for the mothership. If you think about it, pick one, Novartis or somebody like this, since they kind of no longer have a venture fund. Yeah, their venture fund could have been the most successful venture fund in the history of the planet. I'm moving Mark Novartis' bottom line, and they can't make that much money. So their report card's got to have other things on it. And you need to know what those are. So it's perfectly acceptable and a great idea to approach corporate venture funds whose mothership could be interested in what it is you're developing, because that's a line on their report card. Portfolio balance is not going to be important to them. So if they made 3 investments in purple widgets, they're likely to make another investment in a purple widget, whereas a different kind of fund is less likely to do that. They usually prefer a company with a robust pipeline or platform technology. They're not as sensitive to timelines and valuations. They'll talk about them a lot. I mean, they're not a charitable organization, but they're probably a little less sensitive. When you think about it, and we'll get to the pitch decks later, they like science presentations. So decks that are heavy on the financing terms are less interesting to them than the science. You can put more data slides in those decks when you're talking to a corporate VC. And then there's traditional venture capital funds like Sante. So we raise money from multiple limited partners. Most of the time it's like pension plans, things like that. There's only one line on the report card. It's financial returns. Contractually, each venture fund we get money from an LP. The funding documents say that we'll hold it for 10 years. Right, we won't hold it. We have to ask for it as we need it, but that it's a 10-year commitment by them. So that means that when we start investing, we need to start realizing returns at year 4, 5, because they always take longer. So if you try and invest in a bunch of things that you think will return in year 9, they're going to return in year 18. I mean, and you'll be asking for extensions from your LPs. So we are very sensitive to valuation and timelines because we only have the commitment of capital for a brief period of time. 10 years sounds like a long time, but not in biotech development. We're in multiple sectors. Portfolio balance is important. If the space crashes and we've got 4 investments in it, we're going to crash too. So we balance our, so the fact that I'll get these pitch decks in with a cover letter that says, I saw you invested in this. Therefore, you must love this. Here it is again. That's not going to work. We tranche most of our investments. You don't need all the money at once. The tranching is generally milestone based, but we focus a lot on inflection points because that's what's going to determine when you'll need to raise your next round of financing and how much of a step up you can get. You don't want to try and raise the next round of financing around a milestone. I see companies making that mistake all the time. You want to raise it around an inflection point. And that's why it's so important back at the start of this exercise to go through and be really honest with yourself about what are milestones and what are inflection points. So let's go a little bit into the life cycle of the venture fund because it leads to some important points that oftentimes you don't think about. So we have to raise our capital. Believe me, you think you've been abused by, we sit on that side of the desk too, and you wouldn't believe the abuse we hear. It's a humiliating process. So we have to raise our capital, and then we have to start making investments. The companies have to have time to develop. It's a lot of work. We're not just sending checks in and say, right when you get success. We are active, we're on the boards. I'm the acting chief medical officer of one of our companies right now. It's the third time I've done it. We are involved. Then, hopefully, good things happen. The company gets acquired, may go public. So we begin to realize gains. We distribute those gains back to our limited partners. And if we've done that well enough, this gets easier for the next one. It's never real easy, but it gets easier. But there are a couple of implications to this cycle here. Number one is the distribution back to our limited partners. They're looking for a multiple of the entire fund, not how well did an individual investment do, but did you return a multiple of the fund? So I'll often, and that's something that entrepreneurs forget. So I'll often get approached by somebody who say, you give me $5 million. Here's my development path. I'll sell it for 35 million. That's a 7x return. How can you say no to that? The answer is very easily. $35 million not a multiple of the fund or a significant portion of the fund. Now, sometimes I hear, well, if you made 15 investments and never one of them did a 7x return, you'd return 7 times the capital in the fund. Yeah. I wouldn't bother with venture if I had that kind of track record. I'd do something else. So in a typical venture portfolio, let's say it's 10 companies, 10 investments. The published industry average of capital loss is 50%. That's probably wrong. It's probably more like 60%. So 5 to 6, probably 6 of those 10 companies are going to gently sink beneath the waves. 2 are going to tread water. And they're great successes, but they're not out of business. It's 1 or 2 that are the hits. That means that those 1 or 2 have to return the fund or more than the fund if you're going to return a multiple of the fund to your LPs. So when you assess what kind of business am I, you've got to think about what does my exit now, $1 billion, everything. The math works for everything. But the more usual exit, and quit reading the headlines in the trade press, because they're focused on the outliers. There's a survivor bias there. So we went through, I didn't include this slide here, but we periodically go through and list all of the life science company exits. We did it for all the way back to 1999. Before 99 doesn't count. So a couple of fun facts here. So before 1999, there was no life science venture fund in the country that was even $100 million. They were all tiny. What changed was PDUFA, which suddenly led to a wave of approvals, which meant a wave of acquisitions and exits. And suddenly there were a bunch of funds that had made their LPs a lot of money and they could raise a bigger fund. And so they did. They kept raising bigger and bigger funds. Now we have some truly big funds. But and so that's meant more capital has gone into the sector. But there's 2, and I wish I'd put the slides in here, there's 2 interesting findings if you go through and you track exit values of companies in the life science space and also exit value versus capital into a company. Now you would think the more capital that you get into a company, the more likely you are to succeed. The R squared value is 0.2, something like that. I mean, there's very little correlation. It looks like somebody fired a shotgun at a piece of paper. There's very little correlation between the amount of capital that goes into a company and its exit value. The other thing is, if you plot all those exit values in life science space, you start at 0, and that's the highest peak. and then it drops precipitously down and it sort of asymptotically levels out to get out to those billion-dollar exits. So you can't even calculate an average. What we do is we calculate a 5% trimmed mean. In life sciences, you know what it is? It's about $220 million. It's not $1 billion. So we sort of started with the idea that if we're smart, we're not so smart that we're going to escape regression to the mean at some point. That means even our successful exits in particular spaces probably going to be a couple $100 million. So if we're going to return the fund, it also implies that we don't want to be a $1 billion fund, because now it gets really hard to return multiples of the fund. We want to be in that, for 260s, the last fund, 250 was the one before that, kind of a sweet spot. Have a couple of good outcomes, we can return a significant percentage of the capital. We need a couple of outliers, but the other implication is we need to own a fair amount of the deal. It's not doing us any good to own 5% of the usual exit. So that's why you hear the struggles over ownership percentage there. So as you process all that, and you think about what kind of company am I, what does an exit in the kind of company that I am look like, and about how much is it for? Be pretty realistic and be kind of brutal on this. I get pitch decks in that list, acquisitions from 10 years ago, because it helps boost their comps a bit. It's really only what's happened. Well, it varies by the market. So in 2019, we let my comps go all the way back for a couple of years. Right now, a comp from mid-2020 is meaningless, because the market is completely different right now. So be realistic about what your comps are actually telling you. The other thing to pay attention to is the structure of the usual exit. What happens? So I've got a diagnostic company. I've got a great diagnostic. I want it to be widely adopted. What's my usual exit structure look like? It's not that somebody LabCorp comes in and buys me for $400 million cash on the barrelhead. Even if I get bought, LabCorp comes in, they give me $5 million. And then there's a series of revenue-based milestones later that they'll pay. Well, if I'm a traditional venture capital fund, that's not doing me a lot of good. That exits $5 million. Because one, I don't know if this is still true, but it was a truism for a while that these structured deals, and the trade press always totals up the entire value. It's $1 billion, up to $1 billion. It's the upfront money that's the important part. Because that's it's like an NFL contract. That's the only guaranteed money. 50% of companies don't even achieve their first milestone to get that first payment. So I care about things that when they exit where the deal is mostly upfront. Certain service deals, diagnostics, lab tools, those kinds of things can be perfectly great ideas, profitable ideas, good business ideas, but their exit is not going to be structured to attract the traditional venture capital fund. And you're just banging your head against the door when you try and approach those kinds of investors, because your exit doesn't look like what they need. So that all goes back to what is the type of investor that's right for you? And that's what we were just talking about. You really need to study in nice space and not just the outliers, not just the band on a gel that went public for $1 million. Really study what companies in your stage and space, how long it took them to get approved, bought, whatever, and recognize how that may have changed recently. So what opportunity am I selling? And what do those exits look like? That will tell you, we go back to the list of different types of investors and what their report card says. the kinds of investors that you need to be thinking about approaching. You also need to think about what you need that's not just money. So it's great to get capital in. But if you're doing it right, you're getting more from your investors than just capital. Yeah, it's experience. It's been there, done that. It's seen this movie before. They can give you advice. But it's also good if they got like a network. You know, I need access to this, and they have a network, whether that's talent for executive talent, potential acquirers. If you're a, health tech deal for hospital systems, we've got multiple LPs that are big hospital systems. We introduce the company to the hospital system all the time, not in hopes that, well, we do hope they buy it, but as a sounding board, kind of okay, how would you use this? How often would you use it? What would you pay for it? Sort of thing. So you want more than just check. Now, I'll disagree a little bit with Dan. Dan said, and you noticed he hedged on this. So toward the last, he said, take money when you can get it. And he hedged a little bit. Well, maybe not in all cases. I actually don't take money you don't need. Because one, you lose discipline if you've got excess cash, it tends to be spent. Two, you're just layering on another set of obligations to you. You don't need the capital. You may change your financial structure such that it becomes harder to raise capital when you do need money there. But that won't happen too often. As you think about it, as you go forward in the fundraising process, also you've got to listen. Listen to the feedback you're getting from different funds. If all you get is generic passes, you haven't conveyed that you're listening. Most funds will give you some feedback if they think that you'll take it in the right way, not just argue with them. And you got to listen to what they're saying. Be flexible, have backup plans. Sometimes the market's just not going to buy what it is that you're selling. And you've got to think about, okay, oftentimes I get pitched all the time by companies that are raising some enormous amount of money to advance multiple programs because they say, I want multiple shots on goal. But the multiple programs are in completely disparate clinical areas. I know they don't have the expertise in all those areas. I say, have you thought about a smaller round that concentrates on the one program or the first two programs? The thoughtful response is, yeah, we have thought about that. We actually have worked out what our budget timeline development plans look like. I'll share that with you, and it's okay to say, but we're going to continue to test the market because we'd really like to do the big plan. Okay, at least I know you've thought about it and have contingency plans in place. That implies a degree of thoughtfulness that I like. I don't know, you guys aren't having a lot of questions here. Yeah. So once you've been through this whole exercise, yeah, and so let me deliver my finale here. Once you've decided what you are and what kind of investor that you're going to appeal to, that's what your pitch deck needs to reflect. And that's the next step. So, okay, Sarah, what's your question?
I was asking a question. I wonder, so when you see decks that are misaligned, maybe because they are looking at comps from 2 years ago and they're misaligned around either the amount of money they're raising or the valuation that they're aiming for, or what have you, is that for you automatically sort of discount the conversation, or do you tend to try and figure out if there's wiggle room, or how do you usually do that?
That's a good question. Kind of depends on the totality of the vibe of everything from the day. So if I think this is a really good team that really knows this space and has a very interesting technology. But, you know, their development plan is probably too capital intensive, and I don't know that it needs all of the bells and whistles here. I will, you know, I may take a meeting and just ask them. So have you thought about a more scaled down plan that would get you to an inflection point a little faster where you can get a step up? We'll have that conversation. If it's a big round, with a grandiose development plan, I'm not that impressed with the team, or the technology doesn't really seem to fit that, I'm probably not even taking a meeting, because they've just conveyed that, you know, they're unsophisticated about this. It's you want to, the impression you want to give is you've got definite ideas, you understand what it is that you're talking about, but you're also willing to listen and have a conversation. And you also need to go in, whether it's into a meeting or with your pitch deck, or even just thinking about the types of investors that you're going to approach with that exercise that I've talked about. You can't force them to buy something they don't want to buy. So think about the worst experience you ever had with like a used car sales. Now, I remember once I lived in Boston. I live in Boston now, but I lived in Boston previously years ago, and we had rented this little lake house, and we were looking to buy a used car. So I go to the car dealership, and the salesman says, "Where are you guys from?" So, well, we rented a lake house. That's all he heard, lake house. And I said, and we live in Charlestown. There's on-street parking. You can't find it. We've got to have a small car that's very maneuverable on the streets. All he heard is lake house. So he takes me to this enormous Jeep Grand Wagoneer and says, "That baby will pull a boat." I mean, it's just, sometimes entrepreneurs come across like that too. Yeah. I know what your financial model, you say your financial model. Yes. That's the thing you want to avoid. What else? Yes, sir.
Question.
Oh,
That meter behind.
behind
Okay.
you. A nanosecond.
No. Are you sure? Well, I think mine's a quick question.
Okay.
This is more probably about your fund's personal choices. And we're developing a therapeutic, and you know, once somebody's identified a promising target,
Mhm.
you know, everybody, you know, jumps in and tries to do it. So what is your viewpoint when someone comes to you? Do you want it to be the first in class, the first guy, you know, who's on that target, or would you rather it be a fast follower, or maybe even consider those that have really good science coming up, you know, behind that?
Depends on the space. So for a medical device, a fast follower is actually probably the best thing. As long as the company ahead of you is having some success. So, I mean, it may surprise you, but what you don't want is your competitor to become a flaming hit. It's bad for you. So for medical devices, a fast follower is often a good approach. For a therapeutic with a new target, first in class is usually better. It's more attractive to people. We actually, with LOS, we did a kind of a survey of, you know, based on eventual sales and things like that. First in class does better than best in class. Once you've established that beachhead, it's hard. So investors know that too. It's not an insurmountable. I mean, if there's a clear problem, what is the hardest sell is actually a better mousetrap. It's this works, but I've got a better way. Because to a lot of it, particularly early stage investors, that sounds like a quarter turn of the screw there. Yeah, it's better, but it's hard to raise future financing rounds off of that. Okay, yes, sir.
Thank you. How much power have the people who invest in you, like traditional venture capital, for giving you the money on what we are doing on our company? How much the work
Yeah.
creating in what you invest?
Yeah, so there can be certain restrictions, so some of our LPs are like Catholic health systems, and so there are certain things we can't do because of that. But by and large, they're not in there looking through, okay, tell me the primary endpoint of that clinical trial again. I'm not sure I agree. What they do look for is, so when we raise capital, and every fund has to do this, we have to present them a very specific financial thesis. So our financial thesis is, we go early, seed and Series A, we own a large percentage of the deal. Our fund size will not get above this. We'll do anything in healthcare, but we'll concentrate on things where exits tend to be structured the way that are returned to venture funds. Healthcare services, that's sometimes a little difficult because those, like SaaS deals, it's a little difficult, and so there are variances to the thesis depending on if it's a device or a service or a drug. But we tell them we're going to lead or co-lead deals. There's a whole list. And here's why we think that works. We actually go through an exercise where we do Monte Carlo simulations of variety of exercises based on market conditions. Here's how you'll get your return under a lot of these different conditions. And then we do an annual meeting every year. We present the companies we've invested in, and we tell them how that fits the model. So when entrepreneurs pitch me and say, yeah, but I'm not willing to give up that much percentage in the deal, or some other things, to say that doesn't fit our thesis. You may be right. This may be a great idea. You may only need that amount of money. You may only need to give up that. It just doesn't fit our thesis. And we will have to tell our LPs how each investment fits our thesis. And if it doesn't, we have to tell them that too. Now, if it's the last investment in the fund and we've already, given them a 4x return or something, yeah, maybe that's a little play money. But we just raised our fourth fund. The first 6, 7, 8 deals we do have to be right down the fairway of our thesis. And because that, they will ask. That's right.
So you talk about the different type of investor, and for early stage discovery and development, right? We say different staging. So some of them, at early stage, it's novel, it's newer target and newer biology. We usually try to get a grant, which is non-dilutive, and it's easy to get. But at the later stage, everything is validated, but everything becomes standardized, like FDA required milestone, the IND equivalent study. So at this different stage of development, which kind of investor you want to go?
Yeah.
Do you go any like a venture capital can sponsor, can invest at any stage or actually?
No, so some can. But so RA Capital goes all the way from public investments down to Series A. Their early stage investments that's a relatively recent add-on that they only added in the last couple of years. And they do it to invest in companies that they think they can take public, so that their public side can run from them. So there's not many true institutional venture capital funds that will do all stages, because it's hard to have a financial thesis around that. So you can ask them, or they will tell you, we do early stage, or we do growth capital, or we do up to Series B, or something like that. The financial thesis will be somewhat different, and that's why it's important for you to sort of realize what stage you're at as to who you're going to talk to. The other shift that occurs is when you're first getting off the ground and you're getting money you get grants, you may get some angel money or something like that. You just need the capital to get going and start hitting your milestones. And you want the right kind of investor, but they don't necessarily have to be there for the whole ride there. As you move up in stage and development, even if you had like a super angel group that could write a $7 million check or something like that, you may prefer to have an actual venture capital fund, not just because they might participate in the next round, but because that makes it easier in the next round to get other larger later stage funds in. So when you're a startup, when you're a ranked startup, people want to know who's on your cap table. It can be angels, friends and family, that kind of stuff. The next question, if you've got friends and family on there, is what are their expectations of valuation? When we first started with the first Sante Fund in Texas, there was a lot, and particularly down here in Houston, because I was down here, there was a lot of oil and energy money around. Very smart financially, very unsophisticated biologically. And so they would put money into these little startup companies who were glad to get as much cash in as they could get, and then they're locked into a valuation that they can't ever raise another, because they're not worth that. Or the market says they're not worth that. So they took too much money in early, and now they're locked into a valuation that won't let them. They're not ready to make the step to the kind of fund that can write that kind of check. So that's the other thing you got to consider is it's like pool. You know, the really good pool players don't just make the shot. They make the shot so the cue ball gets ready for the next shot. You got to start thinking about that too. So.
When we talk about like your 10-year funds, just trying to think about deals. So say, for example, you're investing in a company in year 4. Right? We're expecting to exit after 8 months, the previous one. So it's year 7. We're successful. We get an offer. We've got a payment, decent upfront payment. Then you've got milestones. The milestones take you past the close. So are you kind of more interested in a bigger upfront of money at that time?
We're always interested in a bigger upfront.
Right. So you will trade off the back end to get the money. So in some ways that could work against the founders in some ways.
Maybe, but remember, like 50% of companies don't even reach their first milestone.
To be hypothetical.
Yeah.
But would you carry on? Would you take on a deal that carries milestone and pass the closing of the fund?
Yeah, I mean, of course, if the upfront were attractive enough, then we've got a deal from Fund 2 that's, Fund 2 is closed, but we're still getting some of those late milestone payments, and we distribute those to our LPs. It does bring up a really interesting point, though, in terms of, so let's pretend for a moment it's a perfect world. We've got multiple investors that are interested. You're trying to assemble your syndicate. You need to think hard about that, about how you build your syndicate. So trouble down the road is if one of your syndicate is a venture fund that's in year 5, needs to exit in the next couple of years, and one of your funds is in year 1. They just raised the fund. Now you get that offer in. The upfront is okay, but it's not fantastic. There's a lot of back-end loaded stuff. The fund in year 1 or 2 is going to be intrigued by that. Fund in year 4 is going to think this may not be the offer I want, or it could be the reverse. The fund in year 4, if they've already, got the term of art is DVPI, distributed versus paid in, and 2.5x to their LPs. This is great. I'll take that deal all day long. The fund in year 2 is thinking, if we just played forward a little bit, we could actually bring that exit value up, and we got time. That's when you get the fights in the board and the indecision about what to do with an offer. And that can be real trouble for the company because the offer then just goes away. What
How do you
else?
all see differences between tech and, oh, sorry, I already started.
Differences in exit time, but yes, yeah, no, so the longest is biotech. I mean, I know last couple of years, it seemed like we just had a great idea, throwing our neck and we went public. But those days are over. By and large, if you truly have to develop something, biotech's the longest. Med tech is probably next longest. Health tech is probably sooner, unless it's a particular health tech that need. So the to some extent for devices and more so for tech, because we're doing health tech. It's not Uber or something like that. So more so for health tech, you got to get to revenue, and what you get acquired on is a multiple of the revenue. And what triggers the acquisition is the ramp. So somebody will buy you if it looks like your revenue, your sales revenue are really going up on a hockey stick. And then that triggers an acquisition because they don't want to wait because you'll get too expensive. Service businesses that are sort of slowly achieve profitability and then kind of do okay, they can be a perfectly great business. They're probably not going to get bought, or if they get bought, it's not going to be very attractive terms like that, and it'll be way later. So even service deals can be variability, but biotech's probably the longest. Somebody here have a question?
I'm not sure we shared this right. You mentioned you also serve as a CMO in the company you
Yes.
invested. What happened? I mean, is that something you prefer? It helps the company?
No, it's a lot of work.
It just.
Yeah,
interesting.
so the rationale, so it's, again, the market sort of changed. So for a period, so I'm an oncologist, by the way. And for a period, the toughest position in the industry to fill was the chief medical officer. It's an oncologist. There's none of them left. So if we thought we had a really interesting technology, I would step in as their chief medical officer until they sort of grew up enough to actually be able to, because, you know, start, they can't afford me. So when they grow up enough where they could, then we would go out and find them a full-time chief medical officer. There are pluses and minuses to that. It's kind of worked for us. It can make it a little bit tough to raise future rounds of financing. We've managed to do it, but we're pretty upfront with the funds that are coming in. That because to their eye, it looks like we've got sort of inside information, you know, better idea of what's going on in the company than they might do just based on the board meetings and things. So there could be a little bit of it's not something that I'd say just needs to be done universally.
I think we have to break. It's lunchtime.
Okay.
Gotta give people time to eat. We are coming back in an hour.
Yep.
So.
We can do more of those questions with pitch deck, because a pitch deck talk is pretty short.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.